There is a kind of work that does not get entered into any ledger. Not the work you volunteer for, and not the work someone pays you to do, but the kind you do because it needs doing and you are the one who sees that it needs doing, which over time becomes the same thing as being the one who does it. You drive the car. You make the appointment, and then you make the follow-up appointment. You sit in the waiting room with a clipboard while someone else sends flowers. You read the contract that got left on the kitchen table because you noticed it sitting there and you know what the clause on page 4 means and what happens if no one catches it. You do these things not because they were assigned to you, not because anyone will remember them specifically, not because you expect to be thanked in the way that actually means something. You do them because you are paying attention, and paying attention is the way you have always taken care of the people in your life. Before I tell you this story, I want to ask you one question. Have you ever been that person? Have you ever been the one in the background? The one who handled it? The one whose contribution was absorbed into the situation without anyone deciding it was worth naming? If the answer is yes, stay with me. This one is for you. My name is Dorothy. Most people who know me call me Dot. I spent 28 years teaching high school chemistry in the same district where I grew up in northwestern Ohio, and I retired in 2014. I am 68 years old. I am not a dramatic person, and I do not tell stories for the effect of them. But I have learned something in the years between 60 and 70 that I did not expect to learn, which is that certain things need to be said out loud, not for the sake of drama, and not for revenge, in the way people usually mean that word, but because the people who recognize them deserve to know they are not alone in having lived them. Welcome to Quiet Proof. If you are new here, this is the channel for people who showed up and did the work and held on to the paperwork. This is a story about a man named James, who worked quietly for 40 years, and planned carefully during the last 11 of them. It is a story about what gets passed down when someone decides that what a person actually does matters more than how visible they are about doing it. It is about the arithmetic of a family, who gets counted and who gets assumed, and about the particular quality of silence in a room when a document says what it says, and there is nothing left to perform. I am not going to tell you how it ends before it gets there. What I will tell you is that the ending surprised exactly the people who assumed they knew what it was going to be, and surprised no one who had been paying close attention to the things that actually mattered, which, in this family, as in most families, turned out to be a smaller group than anyone would have predicted at a birthday dinner. Before I go further, I want to say one more thing about why I am telling this story at all, because I have thought about that question longer than I have thought about most things lately. I am not telling it because I won, and I want you to know it. I am telling it because for 22 years I was the person in the background of that family, the person who was present and functional and largely unremarked upon, and for 22 years I told myself that was fine, that recognition was not the point, that the work mattered regardless of whether anyone saw it. That was true and I still believe it, but I also know now what it meant to be seen by the person who saw everything. And I want you to know that that story exists. That a man who built something with his hands over 40 years also noticed, in detail, who was standing next to him while he did it, and did something about what he noticed. The hardware store on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street in Defiance, Ohio has been in that location since 1982. James told me the exact date he opened it, March 14th, because James was the kind of person who remembered the exact dates of things that mattered to him, and treated those dates as information worth keeping. He was 31 years old when he signed the lease. He had $140 in his checking account, and a landlord who had agreed to defer the first 2 months of rent because James had come in with a business plan typed on 3 pages, and a handshake that the landlord later described, at James's retirement dinner, as the most certain handshake he had received from someone with no money. The store was not large. 4 aisles of hardware and plumbing supplies and fasteners and paint, a service counter in the back where James stood for the first 3 years because he could not afford to hire someone he trusted enough to put there. He opened the door at 7 in the morning and closed it at 6 in the evening, and then stayed until 8 doing inventory, and entering the day's figures into the first of what would become 40 years of handwritten notebooks. He did this 6 days a week for 11 years before he opened the second store. That is not a detail I am including to make him seem admirable. It is a detail I am including because it is accurate, and accuracy is how I was taught to begin. By the time I met James, he had 4 stores. By the time he died, he had 6. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I am not telling a story about a great business success, which it was not in the way that word usually gets used. What James had built was 6 moderately profitable hardware stores in small and mid-sized communities in northwestern Ohio, each of them the kind of store where the person behind the counter knows your name and knows what you are working on, and can point you to the right aisle without looking it up. He was not wealthy. He was comfortable, which is a different thing, and a thing that took him 20 years to become. What he was, consistently and without interruption across those 20 years, was precise. He understood where every dollar came from and where it went. He understood his leases and his supplier contracts and his insurance policies because he read them before signing them. A habit that I later recognized in myself, and that I think was one of the things that told each of us, fairly early on, that the other was someone worth knowing over a long period of time. James did not work the way most people imagine a businessman works. He did not make phone calls pacing around a room. He did not have long lunches with other businessmen talking about the market. He sat at a desk in a small office in the back of the Maple Street store, and he did his books by hand, in a series of black hardcover notebooks that he bought from the same office supply store for 35 years. Always the same brand. Always the same size. One notebook per year. He had a system for categorizing expenses that made sense to him, and that took me several months to learn to read. But once I learned it, I could see that there was a logic to it that was almost elegant. The kind of logic that develops when one person maintains the same record over enough decades that the method stops being a method and becomes a language. He kept his insurance papers in a manila folder labeled Insurance in his own handwriting, his lease agreements in a folder labeled Leases, his supplier contracts in a folder labeled Suppliers. Nobody had told him to organize things this way. It was simply how he thought a responsible person organized the things that mattered, and he had done it this way since 1982 without seeing any reason to change it. James and I met at a school board meeting in the spring of 2001. His son Robert had been suspended from the district for the third time, and James came to the meeting to make the case in person for why the decision was disproportionate to the offense. That was exactly the kind of man he was. He did not call. He did not send a letter on his behalf. He showed up in person with a typed summary of his concerns. I was there representing the teachers' union. We disagreed about the applicable policy for approximately 45 minutes, which is considerably longer than most school board meeting disagreements last, because neither of us was willing to be imprecise about what the policy actually said. After the board moved on to other business, James came over to where I was gathering my things and said, without any particular preamble, that he thought I had made a good argument even though he did not agree with my conclusion, and would I like a cup of coffee? I said I would. We sat in the diner across the street for 2 hours, and I noticed that for most of those 2 hours he was listening more than he was talking, even when he disagreed with something I said, which was not what I had expected from the man who had just argued a school board for 45 minutes without losing his composure once. We were married 3 years after that. James had 2 sons from his first marriage, and I want to be careful here because I believe in being precise about people, especially people who are going to be part of a story where they do not come out equally well in every part. Robert was 22 when James and I married. He was charming in the specific way that some people are charming when the world has mostly agreed, from a young age, to let them be whatever they want to be, without asking too many questions about the cost. He was good-looking and quick, and he had his father's confidence without his father's discipline, which is a particular combination that takes a while to recognize if you are not watching carefully over time. He called me Dot from the first week of knowing me. I had not offered that, and he had not asked. He was not hostile about it, and I do not think it was intentional. It was simply the manner of someone who has always assumed access, who moves through relationships, the way someone moves through a room they have always owned, adjusting things without checking whether adjustments were wanted. He also had a way of thanking you for things that made the thanks feel like the conclusion of a transaction rather than the beginning of an acknowledgement. Kevin was 19 when we married. He had been working in the stores since he was 16, and he knew how to open a location and close it and manage a difficult customer and do the end-of-day count without supervision. He treated me from the beginning with a kind of careful courtesy that I recognized as its own form of respect. The respect of someone who does not know you well enough yet to be warm but who has decided in advance to be decent. We were never close in the way you become close with someone you chose to have in your life. But we were always decent to each other. And in a blended family, decency maintained consistently over 20 years is not a small thing. What I understand now about Kevin that I did not fully understand then is that he had already demonstrated, before I arrived, exactly who he was. In 2008, when Kevin and Robert's mother passed away, her estate included a prenuptial agreement that limited what her sons could receive from it. Robert contested that limitation for 6 months. Kevin accepted it in the first week. I did not know about this when I married James. I learned it much later from Carol. But when I learned it, nothing about Kevin in the preceding years surprised me any differently. I entered that family the way most people enter families they marry into, which is gradually, and with the particular uncertainty of someone learning the rules of a game that has been played for years before they arrived. A blended family has its own grammar, and I learned it through observation rather than through instruction, which suited me because observation is the way I have always learned things that matter. I noticed who sat where at the first holiday table, and I adjusted accordingly. I noticed that Robert called his father every Sunday at 7 in the evening and that James always took those calls even when he was in the middle of something. And I noticed that Kevin showed up at the Maple Street store on Saturday mornings without being asked and without expecting to be thanked for it. I noticed what each of them expected from their father, and I noticed, more slowly, what they each expected from the woman their father had married. The expectation in both cases was, more or less, that I would be present without being prominent, functional without being central. I was good at that. I had been good at that for most of my professional life without calling it anything in particular. In 2006, James signed the lease for the third store without reading the renewal clause on page 7. He left a copy of the signed lease on the kitchen table because he was going to file it and it was waiting there for him. I picked it up because it was in front of me, and I read it because I read things that are in front of me. The way I once read the back of a cereal box or the fine print on a field trip permission slip, out of an ingrained habit of not leaving words unread. The renewal clause allowed for automatic extension with a rent increase of 15% every 3 years with no ceiling on the cumulative total. That is not an unusual clause in a commercial lease. It is also not a clause you want to have without understanding exactly what it will cost you over the full term of the agreement. I showed it to James that evening. He looked at it for about 2 minutes without saying anything. Then he called his landlord the next morning and renegotiated the renewal terms to a flat 3% annual increase with a cap on any single-year adjustment. He did not mention this renegotiation to Robert or Kevin. He did not mention that I had found the clause. That was not a conversation we had. It was simply what had happened and what had been addressed. In 2012, a tenant who had rented the small apartment above the Maple Street store for 11 years asked James for a short-term loan to cover a medical expense between insurance payments. James was going to help him, had already decided to help him, but was going to do it on a handshake because James preferred handshakes for transactions with people he had known for a long time and trusted completely. I suggested a simple written agreement instead, not because I distrusted the tenant, who had paid his rent on time for 11 years and was a man of obvious integrity, but because a written agreement treats both parties with seriousness, creates clarity about expectations, and protects the relationship as much as it protects the money. James agreed, and I drafted 2 paragraphs with a 6-month repayment schedule and no interest. The tenant repaid it in full and on time, and when he did, he sent James a handwritten card that thanked Mr. and Mrs. Alderman, both of us, for the consideration and the trust. Robert was visiting the week the card arrived on the counter. He picked it up and read it and set it down and said to no one in particular that his father was a generous man. He did not say anything about Mrs. Alderman. I noticed that, the way I noticed most things in that house, quietly and without bringing it up. In April of 2014, James and I sat in a doctor's office in Toledo and received a diagnosis that I am not going to name specifically here because the specifics are not what this story is about. What I will tell you is that it was the kind of diagnosis that reorganizes everything that comes after it, that takes the ordinary timeline of a life and makes it suddenly and permanently particular. The office had a large round clock on the wall behind the doctor's head, and I became aware of the sound of it during the appointment in the way you become aware of a sound when your mind is simultaneously trying to absorb information and trying to stay still enough to absorb it accurately. James sat beside me with his hands folded in his lap and asked 3 questions. Not the questions most people ask in that room. He did not ask why this had happened or how long he had. He asked for the statistical progression rate, the standard of care timeline at his current stage, and what the first significant decision point would look like. I wrote those answers in the notebook I had brought because I always brought a notebook to medical appointments, a habit from my teaching years that I had never seen a reason to stop. On the drive home, James said once that he supposed they would figure it out. I said yes, they would. We did not say anything else about it that night. What I did after receiving the diagnosis was what I have always done when something frightens me, which is that I learned everything I could about it. I found the medical literature on the condition and read it over several evenings with a dictionary open beside me for the terminology I did not know, which was most of it at first, and considerably less of it after 3 weeks. I built a spreadsheet to track the relevant laboratory values after each appointment so that James and I could both see the direction of the numbers and what rate they were moving. I called a specialist center in Cleveland and made a second opinion appointment, because I had read enough by then to understand that a higher volume practice would have more current data on the treatment options. James approved all of this without comment, which was how he approved of most things. He was not a passive man. He simply understood that this kind of research was what I was suited to doing, in the same way that he had understood, 8 years earlier, that I was suited to reading the clause on page 7. Over 22 years we had each learned where the other's competencies were, and we had learned to trust them without requiring them to be announced. Coordinating with the boys meant, in practice, that I spoke with Kevin, and Kevin spoke with Robert. No one formally decided on this arrangement. It emerged from what each person was willing to do. Kevin called after every significant appointment. He asked specific questions and took in the answers without editorializing. Robert texted after the calls with Kevin, and sent flowers after the major procedures, long-stemmed arrangements that arrived in a box, and that required finding a vase large enough. I never said anything critical about the flowers, because flowers are not nothing, and I was not interested in keeping a ledger of gestures. But I was also the person who was in the hospital parking structure at 6:45 in the morning before every Cleveland appointment, who had learned which position the car seat needed to be in to make the return drive most comfortable after the treatments, who knew the nurses by name, and knew which questions to ask before a new procedure began. I did not call this anything. It was the next thing that needed doing, and then the thing after that. The arrangement with the business documents began in the second winter after the diagnosis, when James's hands became unreliable on some days, in a way that made the fine work of entering figures into his annual notebooks more difficult than it had been. He called me into his office one afternoon in January and asked me to sit with him. Not to help, exactly. He said sit with me, which was how he asked for things he found it hard to ask for directly. That was the first time I really looked at the shelf behind his desk. There were, at that point, 33 notebooks lined up across 2 rows, each one with a year written on the spine in black permanent marker, starting with 1982 on the far left of the first row, and ending with 2014 on the far right of the second. The books were identical in every other respect. Same cover, same thickness, same weight, uniform. The way things look when one person has been consistent about something across a very long time. I sat down in the chair beside his desk and he opened the current year's notebook and we began, and I did not yet understand what I was sitting down to learn, or why it was going to matter. I learned to read his system over the following months, sitting with him 2 or 3 afternoons a week, when figures needed to be entered, and his hands were making the work slow. The system had taken decades to develop, and had its own internal logic, category names that were abbreviations of something James had decided on in 1982, and never saw a reason to change, because they still worked for him. I learned what each abbreviation stood for. I learned the order in which he moved through the months when reviewing the year. I learned that he always worked backward from the current entry when he needed to check something, because he found that looking at what had already happened felt, in his words, more honest than estimating what was coming. I also learned that he always wore the same green cardigan when he was doing the books. Not a recent green cardigan, the same one, a wool cable knit, that had begun to soften at the elbows, and whose cuffs had a slight irregularity, where he had had it repaired twice, that he had apparently owned since the early 90s. I asked about it once, somewhere in the second winter of sitting with him in that office. He said it helped him remember that what he was doing was important work. I did not ask him to say more. It was one of those answers that was complete in itself, and did not need elaboration. What none of this looked like from the outside is worth saying plainly. From the outside, what I was doing was sitting with my husband in his office on certain afternoons and helping him with some paperwork. That was the entire description that would have occurred to anyone who thought about it, which most people did not. What I was actually doing, over the 2.5 years of those afternoons, was learning the internal architecture of a 40-year business. Its contracts and their specific terms, its supplier relationships and their individual histories, its real estate arrangements and their structures. The way it had been built piece by piece across 4 decades by a man who recorded everything and planned ahead further than anyone knew. I was not learning this because anyone asked me to or because I had a plan for what to do with the knowledge. I was learning it because I was there and because the work needed doing and because, as I have explained, that is how I have always operated. I did not think of it as accumulating anything. I thought of it as being useful to someone who needed me to be useful in that specific way at that specific time. James's 66th birthday dinner was held at a restaurant in Defiance that he had been going to for 40 years, a steakhouse on a side street that had changed owners twice without meaningfully changing its menu, which was one of the things James appreciated about it. There were roughly 20 people there, a mix of family and longtime friends, people who had known him since the early days of the first store. The table was long enough that conversation naturally divided into clusters, and the evening moved, the way those evenings move, when everyone present knows each other reasonably well, and there is no particular tension anyone is expecting to navigate. I was seated between Kevin and Carol, which was where I usually ended up at family gatherings, because Kevin and Carol were consistently pleasant, and because that end of the table tended toward conversations about actual things rather than performances of family feeling. The candles were white. The service was unhurried in the comfortable way of a restaurant where the regulars are known and are not going anywhere. I thought, somewhere in the first hour, that it was a good evening. I thought that with the particular care you take when something is going well and you do not want to say it too loudly. Robert stood up when the main course had been cleared. He stood up with the ease of someone who has planned to stand up and is comfortable with what happens when a room turns toward him. He had dressed well for the occasion, a blazer over a shirt open at the collar, the particular combination that signals effort without looking like effort, and he held his wineglass with the thumb and 2 fingers of his right hand. Robert was a genuinely talented informal public speaker. He understood pacing. He understood how to make a room feel included, and how to use a pause to create weight. When he smiled at someone across the table before beginning to speak, the person he smiled at felt specifically acknowledged. That was a real skill, and I want to be clear that I recognized it as real, because I think understanding that it was real is part of understanding what the next few minutes were. He talked about his father. He talked about what James had built, the stores, the 40 years of showing up, the relationships, the particular way of doing business that James had maintained from the first store on Maple Street through all 6. He was not wrong about any of it. He talked about legacy and what it meant to carry something forward, to be responsible for what had been built, and to make sure it lasted into the next generation. He used the word family 6 times. I know it was 6 because I counted, silently, the way I used to count things in tense faculty meetings when I needed a focal point that was not someone's face. Each time he said family, he was looking in the general direction of where I was sitting, not directly at me but slightly past me, in the way someone looks at a room when they are speaking to it but making a point to one specific person through the deliberate architecture of who they include and who they don't. The last line was this: "We are going to keep this in the family, all of us, because that is what it was built for." And on the word family the 6th time, he looked directly at me and smiled. It was a kind smile. That was almost the worst part of it, how genuinely kind it was. Carol looked at her wineglass for a moment after the room applauded. Kevin looked at the tablecloth. James lifted his glass and smiled at Robert from the head of the table with the expression of a man who was present and appreciating the occasion, and was not going to allow whatever had just been said to become a scene at his birthday dinner, and I did not blame him for that. I picked up my phone under the table and opened the notes application and typed the date, the time, 7:41 in the evening, and the approximate last 2 sentences of the toast. I have been told that this makes me sound cold, and I want to address that. The habit of documentation was in my hands before my feelings had caught up with what the room had just done. It was the same mechanism that made me read the lease clause before I knew why it was going to matter. It was not coldness. It was the few seconds I needed before I was ready to feel what I was about to feel. By the time I put the phone down, I had them. That night, after James had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and thought not about being hurt, though I was hurt in the particular quiet way that takes time to locate precisely, but about a more specific question that had been sitting at the edge of my thinking for longer than I had admitted to myself. I thought about what would happen to the things James had built when he was no longer present to make the decisions about them. I thought about the stores and their leases and their supplier contracts, and the 40 years of notebooks I had spent 2 winters learning to read. I thought about who would be in the room when those decisions needed to be made, and what framework they would bring with them for making them. I knew what Robert's framework looked like. I had heard it 6 times that evening in one word. I did not yet know what James's framework was. That uncertainty sat with me at the table until well after midnight. Then I went to bed. After the birthday dinner, James's condition progressed the way it had been progressing since the diagnosis, which is to say gradually, and without the kind of drama that is easy to track. Each month there was a little less than the month before, and the months were long enough that on any given day the difference was hard to see. But the accumulation was there if you were paying attention to the whole of it. He got tired more easily. He spent more mornings in his office and fewer mornings at the stores. He started handling more by phone, which was not something he had ever preferred, because he had always believed that certain conversations required being in the same room as the other person in order to be read accurately. Kevin came on weekends and helped with inventory and store walkthroughs. Robert came once a month and sometimes less often than that, Carol called me on Thursday evenings to ask how things were going, and I appreciated those calls more than I said, because Carol asking the actual question meant that someone in that part of the family was choosing to ask the actual question, rather than the one that sounded like it but was really about something else. In October of 2021, the autumn before James died, he called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. I remember it was Tuesday because I had been planning to grade some continuing education papers I was helping review for the district, and I set them aside when he called. He was standing in front of the shelves when I came in, the 2 rows of identical notebooks, all of them with years on their spines, all of them the same black cover and the same weight, but on the far right end of the second row, sitting slightly apart from the notebook labeled 2021, there was one more book with nothing written on its spine at all. No year, no label, just the same black cover as all the others, positioned slightly separate in the way something sits when it is distinct from the row it is part of. James took it from the shelf and held it for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something when you have been thinking about the moment of giving it. Then he handed it to me. He said, "Keep this. Read it when you need to find something." I did not ask what I might need to find, or when that occasion might arrive. I had learned, across 22 years, that when James said something without elaborating, the elaboration was either going to come later or it was not necessary yet. I put the notebook in the drawer of my bedside table that evening and did not open it. The hospice conversation happened in December. James's doctor sat with both of us and walked through what the coming months would most likely look like and what options were available for managing them as comfortably as possible. James listened with the same 3-question precision he had brought to every medical conversation across 7 years and asked about timing, about logistics, about what the process would require from each of us practically. I took notes. On the drive back, he said he wanted to be at the house, and I said that was what we would arrange, and that was the last conversation we had that was specifically about planning, because after that, the planning became simply what we did from one day to the next. I learned how to give the medications at the right intervals. I learned how to adjust the positioning for the nights when breathing was harder. I learned the hospice nurses by name and by their individual strengths, because they were not all strong in the same areas and knowing the difference was practical. These are skills that most people discover they have when the situation requires them. They do not feel like skills when you are doing them. They feel like the next thing that needs to be done. There was an afternoon in January, about 3 weeks before the end, when James and I were sitting in the living room. The January light in Ohio comes in flat and silver in the afternoons and makes everything in a room look very still, which suited that afternoon. James had not been talking much in those weeks. I was reading and not requiring him to speak, because I had stopped trying to fill his silences a long time before that, understanding that they were not absences but a different kind of presence. After a long time, he said, without looking away from the window, that he had chosen right. He did not say what he had chosen. He said it in the same tone he used when he was looking at a completed column of figures and confirming that they reconciled, a statement of fact after a review. I did not ask him what he meant. It was not a moment that was asking for a question. I said, quietly, that I thought so too. He nodded. We sat in the silver afternoon light for another half hour without either of us saying anything further. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the other kind. James died on a Tuesday morning in February of 2022. He was 67 years old. The hospice nurse, whose name was Patricia, and who had been with us through most of the previous 6 weeks, called me at 6:17 in the morning. I had been asleep in the way you are asleep when you are also not asleep, and I answered on the first sound. Patricia told me, and I thanked her, and I sat up in the bed with the phone in my hand and looked at the wall across from me for however long it was before I stood up. I called Kevin at 6:45. He said he would come immediately, and he did, driving up from Columbus in just under 2 hours. I called Robert at 7, when I had figured out what I wanted to say. He said he would need a day to arrange things and he would be there as soon as he could. And he arrived 2 days later. I did not assign meaning to the gap. I registered it, the way I registered most things, and moved to the next thing that needed doing. In the days after James died, the house filled and then emptied, the way houses do around a death, people coming to be present and to help, and then returning to their own lives, which is correct and appropriate and how it should be. Kevin stayed for 4 days, and Carol stayed with him. Robert stayed for 2. When they left, I spent the first day alone, doing the practical things, calling the utilities, responding to the condolence cards, eating something in the afternoon, because I knew I needed to. That evening, I went into James's office to sit for a while in the room, where we had spent so much of the past 2 years. The office was exactly as he had left it. The notebooks on the 2 shelves, the folders in their labeled order, On the arm of the chair where he had sat for 4 decades doing the work of understanding where everything was, folded with the kind of deliberate care that takes a moment's intention, was the green cardigan. Not thrown there. Not dropped. Folded. As though he had taken it off carefully before going somewhere else, and would be back for it shortly. I stood in the doorway, and looked at it for a while. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. Sandra Reeves called 4 days after the funeral. She was a partner at a small commercial firm in Toledo, who had handled James's business and estate matters for nearly 15 years. I had met her twice at signings but had not known her well, because James's legal affairs had always been his own domain, something I had access to without being the primary person responsible for it. She did not explain on the phone why she wanted to meet, or rather she explained it in the way that people explain things when the explanation is not the substance. She said she would like to meet before the general family session, which was scheduled for the following Friday. She asked if Wednesday morning would work. I said it would. There was something in the brevity of the call and the specific timing of the request that I heard as information, even though I could not have said what information it was. I wrote it down that evening. Sandra Reeves. Wednesday morning. Before the family meeting. And I waited. I drove to Toledo on Wednesday morning in the flat gray light that February in Ohio reliably provides. A sky that does not offer much in the way of visual interest, but that I have always found useful for thinking, because there is nothing in it that distracts you. The drive was 40 minutes. I had the radio off, which was not my usual practice, but I found that morning that I did not want anything between my thoughts and the road. I thought about the school board meeting in 2001, the 45 minutes of disagreement about policy, coffee afterward in the diner across the street. I thought about James standing in front of the shelves in October and handing me the unlabeled notebook and saying, "Read this when you need to find something," as though that were a complete and sufficient instruction. I did not think about what Sandra was going to tell me because I did not have enough information to think about it productively. I pulled into the lot beside her building at 9:45. The office was on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse, wood-paneled walls and shelves of legal volumes organized by subject, a carpet that had been good quality once and still was, worn at the paths that got the most use. Sandra came around her desk to greet me, which I registered as a small, deliberate choice about the formality of the meeting, and there was a cup of coffee on the low table beside the chairs, prepared before I arrived. I noticed that because it was the kind of detail that tells you something about a person's attention to the situation they have set up. She asked about the drive. I said it was fine. She asked how the week had been and I said manageable. And she nodded in the way of someone who has heard that answer from many people in similar circumstances, and understands that it can mean almost anything. Then she placed her hands on the desk and said she wanted to go through some things with me before Saturday, and she put 2 documents on the table. She walked through the will first, in the organized way of someone who has done this many times and understands the value of a clear sequence. James had left the hardware store business, the operating company, the inventory and the accounts and the brand, equally to Robert and Kevin, 45% each, with the remaining 10% going into a profit-sharing structure for employees who had been with the company for 5 years or longer. He had established the employee structure 8 years ago and had funded it consistently since then. Sandra said the will was clean and had been reviewed and updated at regular intervals. The liquid assets, his personal accounts and a small investment portfolio, were distributed according to a separate schedule that she would walk through with the full group on Friday. I listened and understood it, and none of it surprised me, which was what I had expected. This was the part of the story that would go exactly the way everyone in the room on Friday expected it to go. I nodded. Sandra picked up the second document. The second document was a set of articles of organization from the Ohio Secretary of State. The company name at the top of the first page was Alderman Property Holdings, Limited Liability Company. Sandra explained that James had formed this entity and had used it to hold title to the real property associated with all 6 of the hardware store locations, meaning the land and the buildings. Not the business itself, not the inventory or the brand or the operating accounts, only the physical real estate, the ground the store stood on and the structures they stood in. The distinction was one I had enough familiarity with to understand immediately, and the implications were clear before Sandra had finished the sentence. If the operating company was what the sons were inheriting, and the real estate was held separately by Alderman Property Holdings, then what the sons had inherited was the right to run a business on property they did not own. There was no lease in place between the operating company and Alderman Property Holdings. There had never needed to be one before, because both entities had been effectively controlled by the same person. That was no longer the case. Sandra placed the membership certificate on the table in front of me. The single member of Alderman Property Holdings was listed as James Allen Alderman and Dorothy Jean Alderman, jointly, with right of survivorship. The filing date in the header of the Articles of Organization was October 7, 2011. Sandra noted this date and what it corresponded to. James had filed the entity 3 weeks after experiencing what his cardiologist had classified as a minor cardiac event in September of that year, not the diagnosis that came in 2014. This was earlier, a morning in late September 2011, when James had sat at his desk and found that his left arm was not cooperating in a way that concerned him enough to call the doctor immediately. He had been cleared within 2 days. 3 weeks after that, on October 7th, he had driven to Toledo and formed Alderman Property Holdings with Dorothy Jean Alderman as the co-member with right of survivorship. Sandra said James had been explicit that the structure and the identity of the co-member were not to be discussed with anyone until the time when the documents would speak for themselves. I looked at the membership certificate for 2 full minutes without speaking. Sandra waited without filling the silence, which I appreciated. I asked first, "Did Robert and Kevin know about this entity?" She said James had not discussed it with them, and that this had been consistent across every planning session they had conducted since 2011. He had wanted the documents to speak for themselves without any prior conversation, that could be characterized afterward as an explanation or a negotiation. I asked second, "When had I been informed?" She said this morning. This conversation, she said James had specifically instructed her to wait until after his death and to inform me separately and before the family session. I looked at the window across the room, north-facing, showing a portion of the February sky. I thought about October 7th, 2011. I thought about a man sitting at his desk in late September and finding his left arm not working the way it should. 3 weeks later, a drive to Toledo. I did not turn the radio on for the drive home either. I drove with both hands on the wheel in the positions I had been taught in driver's education 45 years before, and I let the route manage itself because I had driven it often enough that it did not need my conscious attention. What my conscious attention was doing is difficult to describe precisely, except to say it was not thinking, exactly, but absorbing. The way a fact needs time to travel from the part of your mind that receives it to the part that understands what it will mean going forward. October 7th, 2011. James had driven to Toledo 3 weeks after his left arm stopped cooperating for a morning, and he had filed a document, and he had driven back to Defiance, and he had sat at his desk in the green cardigan, and entered, in the appropriate place, in the appropriate notebook, the fact that a decision had been made. And then he had not mentioned it to anyone for 11 years. At home I sat in the kitchen without turning on the lights. It was mid-afternoon, but the February sky was dark enough that the kitchen was in a kind of ambient gray that suited the moment and that I did not try to dispel. I sat at the table in the chair closest to the window and I thought. I thought about the birthday dinner and Robert's toast and the 6 uses of the word family, each one directed past where I was sitting. I thought about 22 years of lease clauses caught, and appointments kept and afternoons in that office and afternoons in hospital parking structures. I thought about the way the thanks always felt like a door closing. And I thought about a man who read every contract before signing it and kept every receipt organized by year, who had on October 7th, 2011 driven to Toledo and done a quiet and specific and legally precise thing that he had maintained without announcement for a decade and then instructed his attorney to allow the documents to explain. He had known then. He had known for 11 years before anyone else was in a position to know. He had chosen right. That was what he had meant by it, in January, in the silver afternoon light. I did not open the notebook that night. I made dinner and ate it, and washed the dishes, and sat in the living room with a book I could not make myself read, and then I went to bed. The notebook was in the bedside drawer where it had been since October when James handed it to me, and I was aware of it there in the way you are aware of something that is waiting for you, not with anxiety but with a settled understanding, that it will be there when you are ready. I have come to believe that certain kinds of information need you to arrive at a particular readiness before they can be received fully, not because the information changes based on your state, but because what you are able to do with it does. I had learned what Sandra had told me that morning. I needed the evening to become ready for the rest of it. I fell asleep earlier than I expected, which surprised me, and also did not, because I had been very tired for a very long time. I woke at 5 in the morning and lay in the dark for a while, and then got up and made coffee, and carried the mug back to the bedroom and opened the drawer of the bedside table and took out the notebook. It had the same cover as all the others on James's shelf. The same black, the same weight, the same size. different only in the spine, which had nothing written on it. No year in black marker, no label, just the cover. I carried it to the chair by the window and sat down with the coffee and the pale beginning of morning coming in from the east, and I held it for a moment without opening it. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, but because I understood, sitting there with it in my hands, that this was the last thing James had prepared for me to read, and I wanted to receive it in the right posture. Then I opened it. Most of the pages were blank. Not empty from disuse, but intentionally blank, the way something is left blank when the blankness is part of what is being communicated. The writing was only on the first page. One entry, in James's handwriting. The upright, careful script I had learned to read over 2 years of sitting beside him in his office. The entry was formatted the way all his entries were formatted, a date on the left margin, a description in the center, and the relevant information to the right. The date was October 7th, 2011. The description read, Alderman Property Holdings, formation complete. And then, in the space where any other entry would have held a number, a figure representing something that could be measured and counted, he had written instead. Member, Dorothy Jean Alderman. Reason. The work that was never entered anywhere else. His signature below it, the same signature he had used at the bottom of every notebook entry for 4 decades. That was all. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. I set the notebook on the arm of the chair and looked out the window at the line of lighter gray that was beginning to form above the roofline across the street, and I did not say anything out loud. There was nothing that needed to be said out loud. He had already said it, on October 7th, 2011, in the only language he was completely fluent in. I sat with the notebook for a long time after that, not rereading it exactly, but returning to the page intermittently the way you return to something you are trying to hold accurately in your memory. What it meant was not complicated. It was the opposite of complicated. It was the simplest thing I had encountered in those weeks, which had not been simple in any other respect. The work that was never entered anywhere else. He had seen it. Across 22 years and 40 winters and 4 decades of notebooks, he had seen the work that no one else had thought to name, and he had named it, in his way, in his language, in a document he had prepared and stored and given to me at exactly the right moment. He had not announced it. He had not brought it up at a birthday dinner or used it in a toast. He had put it in writing, the way he put everything important, and he had trusted that when the time came I would be ready to read it and understand what he meant. He had been right about that, which should not have surprised me. He was usually right about things he had been watching carefully over a long period of time. I closed the notebook when the morning was fully arrived and the light through the window had changed from gray to the pale flat yellow that serves as sun in Ohio in February. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the counter and made a second cup of coffee and stood looking out at the backyard. The garden beds were still covered in the mulch I had put down in November, the ground underneath them still frozen. James had liked that garden. He had not gardened himself, but he had liked to look at it from the kitchen window, particularly in the early morning before the day had started. I thought about that, about the things he had liked without requiring them to be discussed. Then I thought about Friday. About Sandra's office and the family session and what was going to happen in that room when the document was read and the room understood what it said. I thought about what I wanted from that room, and I was honest with myself about the answer, which was not exactly what I would have said if anyone had been listening. Then I poured the rest of the coffee down the sink and went to get dressed. The family session was on a Friday morning at 9. I arrived at Sandra's office at 9:15, 15 minutes before the scheduled time, because I had wanted to be in the room before the others arrived, and to have a few minutes in which it was simply a room. Robert arrived at 9:25 with an attorney I had not met before, a man in his 50s with a briefcase who shook hands and took the chair to Robert's left. No one had been told to bring counsel, and no one had been told not to. Robert introduced him as someone helping with some planning matters, which was technically accurate and also not what anyone present was thinking. Kevin and Carol arrived at 9:27. Kevin was wearing the sport coat he kept for occasions that required a sport coat, and Carol sat beside him and when she sat down glanced across the table at me with the brief, clear look of someone who wants to acknowledge that they see you, without making it a statement. Robert was still talking when they came in, mid-sentence about a management consolidation he had been thinking through that would simplify the operational structure across the 6 locations. Sandra came in, asked everyone to sit down, and said she was ready to begin. Sandra walked through the will methodically, in the same order she had walked through it with me on Wednesday, beginning with the business assets. The operating company, 45% to Robert and 45% to Kevin. The employee profit-sharing structure, the 10% allocation, the vesting schedule, and the funding mechanism James had set up 8 years before and maintained without interruption. The liquid assets distributed according to the personal schedule. Sandra read each section and paused for questions. There were none. Robert nodded throughout with the composure of a man confirming what he has already internally established as true, the manner of someone who has done the accounting in his own mind and is watching the official version catch up to the private one. Kevin listened without changing his expression. I watched Kevin more than I watched Robert during this portion of the meeting because Kevin's face was the more honest register of what was happening in the room, and what his face said was that he was waiting, with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to pay attention to what is not yet being said. Sandra placed the will on the table and picked up the second document. She read the name of the entity first: Alderman Property Holdings, Limited Liability Company, State of Ohio. She explained its purpose, the commercial real estate underlying all 6 store locations. She explained the membership structure, James and Dorothy jointly, right of survivorship. She explained the legal effect of the survivorship right following James's death. There was a silence in the room that was qualitatively different from the earlier silences. Robert's attorney leaned forward. Robert himself moved through a sequence of expressions that I watched, with the attention I had spent 28 years developing, the capacity to read what is happening in a room because your livelihood depends on it. The first expression was genuine incomprehension. The second was rapid calculation. The third was something harder and more deliberate, the face of a person who is deciding, in real time, what posture to adopt. He said, in a voice that was more controlled than I would have expected, I was not aware of this entity. Sandra said James had formed it in October of 2011 and had maintained it in good standing continuously since that date. The building's heating system was audible in the silence that followed. Robert said that Dorothy had had access to all of his father's files. He did not specify what implication he intended the statement to carry, but the implication was not obscure. Sandra said that the entity had been formed in October of 2011, at which point Dorothy had been married to James for 7 years. She said the medical diagnosis being perhaps referred to had occurred in 2014, 3 years after the formation of the entity. She said the documentation made the timeline clear, and she would provide complete copies to anyone who wanted to review them. Robert's attorney made a note. Kevin said, in his practical way, without inflection in either direction, "How long has this structure been in effect?" Sandra said 11 years. Kevin looked at the table. Then I said I wanted to say something directly, and everyone in the room turned toward me. I said, I did not know this company existed until Wednesday morning, when Sandra contacted me in advance of this meeting, as James had instructed her to do. I want that stated clearly, and I want both of you to hear it from me in person. Your father made this decision in October of 2011. He maintained it for 11 years. He chose not to discuss it, which was consistent with how he had made every significant business decision I was ever aware of him making. Sandra can confirm when I was first informed. Sandra confirmed it. Robert absorbed this and then tried a different approach, his voice moving into a register that was less confrontational and more exploratory, the manner of someone who has decided to reframe rather than push through. He said he was not suggesting anything improper, but he did want to note that certain aspects of the timing and structure would benefit from a thorough review before any further decisions were made. His attorney nodded. Kevin, who had said nothing since his question about the timeline, sat with his hands on the table and did not move. I said, "What aspects specifically would you like to review?" I said it without an edge, because I did not need one. I said that the documentation included the original articles of organization, filed with the Ohio Secretary of State on October 7, 2011, 9 consecutive annual reports maintaining the entity in good standing, the registered agent records, and the federal tax filings across all 11 years. I said Sandra could make all of it available for review, and was happy to do so. I said this in the tone of someone reading items off a list that has been prepared in advance, because it had been. Kevin had still not spoken since asking about the timeline. Now he looked up from the table and said, "What does this mean for the stores? Can they continue operating?" His voice was the same practical voice he always had for questions that had practical answers. I said yes. I said the stores could continue without any change to their daily operations. I said what needed to be established was a formal lease agreement between the operating company and Alderman Property Holdings, which did not currently exist because it had not previously been necessary. I said I wanted to work with both of them to arrive at a fair commercial arrangement based on actual market rates, something that gave the business a stable and predictable cost structure for the long term. I said this was genuinely what I wanted, and that I had thought about it carefully before coming into that room. Kevin said that sounded reasonable. Robert said they would need to review everything very carefully. His attorney agreed. I said I understood completely. I stood up then, because everything that needed to be said in that room had been said. I thanked Sandra. I looked at Kevin and I said I meant what I had said about working together and I would be in touch through Sandra whenever he was ready. He nodded once, in the way Kevin nodded when he meant it. I looked at Robert and said, I hoped we could find a path forward that served what his father had built, because that was genuinely what I hoped. Robert was looking at the document on the table. He looked up when I spoke and held my gaze for a moment with an expression that I chose not to try to read. I said I would be in touch through Sandra. Then I picked up my folder and my coat and walked out through the anteroom and down the stairs and out into the February air, which was cold and completely clear, and I stood beside my car in the parking lot for a moment before getting in. Just to stand in the air, just to be outside the room. Robert's attorney sent the first letter 12 days later. It was 3 pages, measured in its language, raising questions about the timeline and the formation of the entity, and suggesting that a closer review of the circumstances might be warranted before decisions about the property were finalized. Sandra responded with 5 pages of documentation. The original articles of organization, the Secretary of State confirmation number and filing receipt, the registered agent records showing 11 consecutive years of maintenance in good standing, and a cover letter noting the relevant dates and their relationship to the medical records available through James's treating physician. I read Sandra's response when she copied me on it. I noted the date in my own records. I did not call Robert or send any message of my own. There was nothing I needed to add to what the documents had already said. The second letter came 3 weeks later. The third came a month after that, noticeably shorter and somewhat less assertive in its framing than the first 2 had been. Sandra responded to both with the same documentation and noted in her response to the third letter that the filing date of October 7, 2011, was now established through 4 independent documentary sources, and that the medical records confirming the September 2011 cardiac event were available through the appropriate channels. By the time the third letter arrived, I had stopped reading them with close attention. The date was the date. The document was the document. James had been careful for 11 years, and Sandra had been thorough for 15, and the combination of those 2 things was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was to speak clearly enough that there was not much left to argue about. I thought about that on the Tuesday evening I read the third letter at my kitchen table. I thought, that is exactly what he would have intended. Robert sold his share of the operating company to Kevin in the spring. I learned this from Carol, who called on a Thursday evening with the particular warmth of someone who has been thinking about making a call for a few days and decided it was the right thing to do. She said Kevin had wanted me to hear it from a person rather than encounter it through other channels. The process had been completed without significant difficulty. Robert was relocating to Arizona. Carol said he had seemed ready to move on and Kevin had made the transition as straightforward as he could make it. I thanked Carol for calling. I said I hoped Robert found what he was looking for out there and I meant it without any particular weight attached to it, which I noticed as a piece of information about where I was in the whole of it. Then she said Kevin was thinking about calling me directly. I said that would be welcome. Kevin called the following Monday morning. Not through Carol. Not through Sandra. He called directly, and he said he wanted to say something to me without an intermediary. He said he did not think his father had done anything wrong. He said he thought his father had paid attention to something for a long time and had acted on it in the way he acted on everything he concluded, which was carefully and without announcement. He said he wanted me to know he understood that and that he was not going to pretend he did not. I said, "Thank you, Kevin." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can we talk about the lease arrangement when you have time?" I said we could. I said I would have Sandra set up a meeting for whenever worked for him. He said next week if possible. I said next week worked. We ended the call and I sat with the phone for a moment before putting it down. We met the following Thursday in Sandra's office with a commercial real estate firm that had prepared independent market assessments for all 6 locations. Kevin came with his own analysis of the comparable data, which he had prepared himself, and which I recognized as a quality of his that had been less visible when James was present to be compared against. We agreed on the rates in less than 40 minutes. Kevin asked for a stability clause with a cap on annual increases, and I agreed because it was reasonable and because it served the interests of a business that needed to plan its costs. We agreed on a 15-year initial term. Sandra drafted the agreement, and we both signed it at a meeting 3 weeks later. The whole process from the family session to the executed lease took 4 months and 1 week. I know the timing because I record dates. The lease went into effect on the 1st of June of 2022. The payment structure was quarterly across all 6 properties, flowing through an account Sandra had helped me establish for Alderman Property Holdings. At the end of the first full year, accounting for property taxes and insurance and maintenance reserves, the net income was a substantial and reliable number that was considerably larger than anything I had managed at any point in my previous life. I want to be precise about what I felt about that number. I did not feel triumphant. I felt what I imagine most people feel when a large abstract fact becomes a specific concrete one, a kind of sobriety, the understanding that things are now different and that different requires decisions, and that the decisions are mine to make. Kevin called on the first Monday of every month. The calls were consistent in structure, a brief report on each location, any significant operational matters, maintenance issues, staffing. Each call ran between 12 and 20 minutes. Kevin was a precise reporter, which was a quality of his. I had not had reason to observe when James was still in the room. He asked questions occasionally, practical ones about the property itself, and I answered directly when I knew and told him I would check when I did not. We were not warm with each other, exactly. We were something that suited what we were, which was 2 people managing a long business relationship who had also been adjacent to each other in the same family for 2 decades. I think James would have found this arrangement exactly correct. He had always been more interested in function than in warmth, which was one of the ways Kevin resembled him more than either of them had probably known while James was alive to make the resemblance visible. In the fall of 2022, I met with the community foundation that served Defiance County to discuss establishing a scholarship fund. James had talked in his last years about the skilled trades with the particular knowledge of someone who had spent 4 decades depending on people who knew how to fix things. Electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, automotive mechanics. He thought the training pipeline for those skills was more broken than most people realized, and that someone with the means to do something about it probably should. I thought about the fact that I was now in a position to do something about it, and that it was the kind of something he would have approved of without requiring it to be named after him. The scholarship supports students at community and technical colleges, pursuing credentials in the skilled trades. The kind of training that keeps the infrastructure of ordinary life functioning. That was what James would have called exactly the right thing. The first 3 recipients were named in October of 2023. Sandra was on the selection committee because she had asked to be and because she had known James for 15 years and understood what the fund was in honor of. Kevin sent a card when the announcement came out. On the inside, in his handwriting, it said, "Dad would have liked this. Nothing else." I put the card in the drawer of my bedside table beside the notebook with no year on the spine. Carol called separately to say she and Kevin were thinking about attending the awards ceremony in the spring. If I thought that would be appropriate. I said it would be very appropriate. I meant it genuinely, which I also took as a piece of information about where things were. There is something that did not come back. That is not a legal thing or a financial thing, and I want to be honest about it because I do not think this story is useful if it presents itself as cleaner than it was. For most of the 22 years I was in that family I held, somewhere below where I would have acknowledged it if asked directly, a hope that I would one day be included in it, in the way you are included in something when you stop being the person who has to earn inclusion, and simply belong. It was not a large hope or an urgent one. It was the kind that lives quietly in the background of things, that you do not examine too closely because examining it means admitting how much it matters. What I understand now is that hope will not be realized. Not with Robert, who has been in Arizona for 2 years, and with whom I have had no contact. Understanding that is not the same as being fine with it, and I want to say that clearly. It is simply what is true, and I have found, across the past 2 years, that the most useful thing I can do with what is true is to see it accurately and let it be what it is. In the summer after James died, I spent several weeks going through all 40 of the annual notebooks, starting with 1982 and working forward through the decades. I was not looking for anything. I was doing what I do when I want to understand something important, which is to start at the beginning and read carefully and let the picture form as I go, rather than going in with conclusions. What I found across those 40 notebooks was the record of a man building something over 4 decades, the specific texture of it, every setback and adjustment documented in the same careful script, every major decision noted in the same abbreviated categories I had learned over 2 years of sitting beside him. In the October entries of 2011, near the bottom of the last page of that year's notebook, written in slightly different ink as though added after the regular entries were complete, was a single line. APH formed, C separate. He had noted it. In the appropriate place, in the appropriate month, in his own system. And then he had closed the notebook and put it on the shelf with all the others. In early July, I went back into James's office to begin making it a room I was using rather than a room I was visiting. The green cardigan was still on the arm of the chair where it had been since February, where I had left it because I had not been ready before then to do anything about it. On a Wednesday morning, I took it from the chair and carried it to the laundry room and washed it in cold water and laid it flat on the counter beside the sink to dry, the way wool needs to dry if you want it to keep its shape. When it was dry, I folded it and carried it to the bedroom and put it on the shelf above James's other sweaters in the closet. I held it for a moment before I put it down. It smelled like laundry detergent now rather than like him, which was correct and also a small loss. The kind of small loss that does not break you but that you carry with you as part of what the year has been. I put it on the shelf. I closed the closet door. I went back to the office and kept going. What all of this cost me was a family, not the family I had but the one I had believed. Over 22 years, I was in the process of becoming part of. A blended family is a long project that requires everyone involved to keep choosing it, and what I understand now is that the choosing was not happening on all sides in the proportions I had needed it to be. James was choosing. Kevin, in his careful and limited way, was choosing. Robert was not and had not been, and the evidence for that was available throughout, and I had been selective about how I read it, which is something I am accounting for honestly now rather than leaving it out. What I have instead is a relationship with Kevin that functions, and is genuine within its limits. A scholarship fund doing what it was designed to do. A set of properties I manage, and a set of notebooks on a shelf that represent 40 years of a man's careful attention. That is not nothing. In most lights, it is quite a lot. I am still working out exactly which light to use on any given morning. The morning after everything was finalized, I woke at my regular time and made coffee and sat in the kitchen and looked out at the backyard. There was nothing significant about the morning. It was early April, which in Ohio means the ground is still cold but the light is beginning to come back in the way it does. A few minutes longer each day without you noticing it happening until one morning you realize it is past 6:30, and still light outside and something in you relaxes that has been held tight for months. I sat with my coffee for about half an hour, without needing to make a call or respond to a letter or manage anything. I thought, this is the thing I did not know I was waiting for. Not the outcome of any specific legal matter. Not any particular number in an account. This specific morning. This specific quality of having nothing that required managing for a little while. I am not sure James planned for me to have that morning, but I think he would have recognized it as part of what he was making possible. He usually planned further ahead than anyone gave him credit for. I want to tell you what I am not certain about, because I think the usefulness of a story is reduced when it presents itself as more resolved than it is. I am not certain that James made the best possible choice in the way he made it. The legal choice I do not question. The structure was sound and the reasoning was documented, and it stood up to every test it was put to. What I question sometimes, not urgently, but in the way you turn something over when there is nothing to be done about it, is whether a different human choice alongside the legal one might have produced a better family. If James had said to his sons at some point in those 11 years, "Here is what I have done, and here is why I chose to do it," I wonder whether Robert would have received that conversation any differently than he received the outcome. I suspect not. But I am less certain about Kevin, who has never resisted what is fair once he understands it, and that uncertainty about Kevin means I hold something incomplete about the whole of it. That is probably appropriate. Very few things that actually matter are fully complete. What I am certain about is simpler. People who do work that goes unrecorded are not doing it in the dark to everyone. They are doing it in the dark to some people, and in clear view to others. And the others are often the people who matter most to the outcome of things. I spent 22 years operating on the assumption that I was not being seen, and what I know now is that I was wrong about that in an important way. I was not seen by the people I had hoped to be seen by, which is a different thing, and the hope was real, and the disappointment that came from it is real, and I do not want to minimize either one. But I was also seen, specifically and carefully and across 22 years, by a man who expressed what he saw in the only language he was completely fluent in. A document filed on October 7, 2011. An entry in a notebook with no year on the spine. The work that was never entered anywhere else. The 40 notebooks are on a shelf in my office now. Both rows of them, the books from 1982 through 2014 on the first row, and the more recent ones on the second, and at the end of the second row, sitting slightly apart from the others the way it always sat slightly apart from the others, the notebook with nothing on the spine. 40 years of meticulous record on the left, organized by year, the chronological account of a man building something and taking care of it across 4 decades. One book on the right with no year and one entry on the first page. I look at that shelf most mornings when I sit down at the desk. because the shelf is behind the desk and I face it when I work. Sometimes the notebooks are just books on a shelf and I do not think anything about them. But sometimes, usually in the early morning when the light is coming in at a low angle and the room is still quiet, I look at them and I understand something about the relationship between what gets recorded and what gets remembered, and about the particular form of attention that expresses itself, not in words at a birthday dinner, but in a document filed with the state of Ohio, on a Tuesday, in October. If this story found you at the right time, I hope you will take something from it that is yours to take. I cannot tell you what that is because it depends on what you brought with you today. But if you have been the person in the background, the one who drove the hours and kept the records and attended the appointments and did the work that got absorbed into the situation without anyone deciding to name it, I want you to know that your record exists. The fact that it has not been formally acknowledged does not mean it is not there. It is there in the way that all careful work is there, patient and specific, waiting for the conditions that make it visible. Some of those conditions arrive in your lifetime and some of them do not. And I am aware that this is a story where they did, which is not everyone's story, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. But the work was real before the conditions arrived. It was always real. Drop a comment if you know someone who needed to hear this today. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. We keep things documented around here. End of script.